young soldier's life began in much the same way for many who joined the ranks in medieval times. It was a life shaped by routine, repetition, and a constant reminder of duty. They were often just boys when they started, taken from their homes, or brought in by their families or lords, thrust into a life they could hardly comprehend. Their world was dominated by the constant demands of the military, and it wasn't long before they understood that their personal desires had little place in this new existence. They woke early, before the first light of dawn, with the chill of the morning air still heavy upon their skin. The sound of birds, still quiet in the sky, was drowned out by the noise of clanking metal, the hiss of sharpening swords, and the voices of officers barking orders. There were no moments of peace, no idle time. The soldier's day was filled with the harshness of endless work. The first task each day was routine, seemingly insignificant, but necessary for survival. They would clean their armor, a process that took far longer than one might imagine. Each piece had to be inspected, polished, and oiled. The joints needed to be checked for rust, and the metal had to be carefully tended to, ensuring it would hold up when the time came for battle. There was no room for mistakes. The soldier would then move on to sharpen their sword, a repetitive action that required focus but allowed the mind to wander. The rhythmic motion of the whetstone against the blade became as familiar as the sound of their own heartbeat. It was a task that demanded attention but was ultimately dull, the sort of mindless labor that passed the time without any sense of urgency. But it was a necessary task. Without a sharp sword, a soldier would be of little use when it came time to fight. Once their gear was ready, they would eat a simple breakfast bread and perhaps a bit of cheese, if they were lucky. There was no time for a leisurely meal. The food was often cold, often stale, and far from the hearty feasts that knights or lords might enjoy. This meal was a mere sustenance, a means to get through the day. Afterward, they would prepare for the next task, training. It was a grueling, unrelenting process. Each day followed the same pattern. They would spend hours learning the basics of combat, how to hold a sword, how to wield a spear, how to form ranks and march in formation. These tasks were practiced again and again, with little variation. The soldiers learned to fight as a unit, to move in unison, and to respond to commands with speed and precision. There was no room for improvisation or thought. They were taught to act without hesitation. The formations were simple but crucial, and the soldiers drilled them tirelessly. Even when their muscles ached and their feet bled, the field where they trained was often a barren, muddy place marked by the ruts of hundreds of soldiers before them. It was far from the romanticized vision of knights training in grand courts or beautiful meadows. The field was rough, the earth uneven, and the air heavy with the smell of sweat and the dampness of the ground. The soldiers could feel the weight of their armor as they moved, the metal a constant reminder of their purpose. But despite the discomfort, there was a rhythm to the movement. It was in the swish of a sword cutting through the air, in the thud of boots against the ground, in the echo of shouted commands. It was a dance of sorts, though a most mechanical one. There was nothing graceful about it, nothing elegant. It was just repetition, over and over, until the soldiers moved without thinking. Their bodies conditioned to follow orders without question. As the day wore on, the soldier's mind would begin to wander. The heat of the sun would press down on them, the weight of their armor growing more burdensome with every step. They would march in formation, their bodies aching, their minds dulled by the constant repetition. Some soldiers might glance at one another, their expressions blank, eyes tired. They had no conversations. There was no talking among them. The silence of their shared experience was deafening. The only sounds, the thudding of feet and the distant orders of officers. When one soldier stumbled or faltered, the others would continue without pause. A constant reminder of the collective nature of their life. They were just one part of a greater machine, a machine that required them to keep moving forward, no matter the cost. The mental strain was perhaps the most exhausting part of this daily routine. There were no distractions, no diversions. The soldiers were left alone with their thoughts, which often turned toward their homes, their families, and the life they had left behind. Some might have wondered if they would ever return home, if they would ever find the freedom they once had. But these thoughts were fleeting, pushed aside by the unyielding demands of the military life. A soldier's life was not their own. They lived for their Lord, for the army, for the collective cause. Their own desires were irrelevant. There was no room for self-reflection, no time for personal dreams. Each soldier had to keep moving forward, had to keep going, had to keep enduring the pain, the monotony, the repetition. During the rare moments of rest, soldiers would sit together in the barracks, their faces tired, their eyes hollow. There was little to do in their free time, but they would attempt to distract themselves with small tasks, mending their boots, polishing their armor, cleaning their weapons. These tasks, though menial, gave them a sense of purpose, a small way to maintain control over their lives. But even these tasks were repetitive. There was no escape from the cycle. They could not escape the army, could not escape the constant demands of training and duty. They had become slaves to routine, to discipline. When the sun finally began to set, the soldiers would gather for their evening meal. It was a simple meal, often consisting of stale bread, boiled meat, and perhaps some vegetables if they were fortunate. There was little time to enjoy the food. The soldiers ate quickly, often in silence. There was no room for conversation, no time for relaxation. The meal was simply a necessary part of the day, and once it was over, the soldiers would retire to their quarters to rest for a few hours before the cycle began again the next day. But even in sleep, there was no peace. The soldiers knew that the next day would bring more of the same. The dull, monotonous life of a medieval soldier was a life built on repetition. Every day was a copy of the one before it, and there was no sense of progress, no sense of movement forward. The soldiers were not growing or improving. They were simply enduring. Despite the hardships, despite the monotony, the soldiers pushed on. They had little choice. This was the life they had chosen, or rather, the life they had been chosen for. Then there was no escape. For most of them, this was their life now. There was no way out of the army. They had no future beyond this routine. They could only live for the present, and that present was filled with endless drills, endless marches, and endless toil. For some, this life would eventually lead to battle, but for many, it would not. The life of a medieval soldier was often one of waiting, of enduring the long stretches of time between conflicts. It was a life of routine, a life that stretched on endlessly without any clear purpose or direction. It was a life where the soldier's existence was defined not by moments of glory, but by the slow, grinding passage of time. And so the days passed. Each one was a blur of training, of sweat, of hunger, and of exhaustion. The soldiers kept moving, kept going through the motions, their lives shaped by the demands of their role. They were soldiers, nothing more, and in that simple truth, there was a certain numbness. a resignation to the fact that their lives would always be this weddle, dangerous, and unending. As the soldiers settled into their routines, the small daily rituals became the very fabric of their existence. The harshness of the work, the weight of their armor, and the relentless repetition of their training did little to distract them from the crushing sense of routine. The monotony was not just physical but mental, seeping into their very thoughts until everything began to feel like a haze, as though they were caught in an endless loop of the same actions. Each soldier moved in a haze of exhaustion, their movements mechanical, their minds weary. They no longer questioned their orders or the endless training. It was simply what had to be done. There was no joy to be found in the task, no satisfaction in improvement, just the constant need to continue. There were no moments of triumph, no sense of accomplishment to mark the end of a day. The soldiers simply moved through the motions, from one task to the next, with no end in sight. The days blurred into one another, indistinguishable from the last. The sun rose, the soldiers would train, eat, clean their weapons, and sleep, only for the same cycle to begin again the following day. The calendar lost its meaning. There was no longer any distinction between weekdays and weekends, between seasons. Everything was tied to the unyielding rhythm of military life, the calendar reduced to a never-ending march. Sometimes, when the weather was particularly harsh, when the cold wind howled through the barracks and the rain battered the soldiers' tents, the monotony would feel particularly unbearable. The soldiers would huddle together for warmth, their faces weary and tired, their thoughts drifting into the quiet nothingness of their existence. The barracks, though crowded, were often silent. There was no sound of laughter, no conversations about dreams or the future. The soldiers were too tired for that. Even their occasional conversations revolved around the same tired topics: complaints about the food, the cold, the endless drills. In their fatigue, the soldiers had learned to avoid each other's eyes. There was no need to engage in conversation when the answers were always the same. What made it worse was that even those small breaks, those few precious hours of respite, quickly filled with other responsibilities. A soldier's life was never truly their own. Even in the brief moments of rest, they had to remain vigilant, knowing that at any moment they could be called upon to serve. The officer in charge would often make rounds, inspecting each soldier's gear and ensuring that everything was in order. The slightest infraction could lead to punishment, and so the soldiers had to remain constantly prepared, constantly aware. Some soldiers began to grow resentful, their frustration building beneath the surface. There were no opportunities for personal growth, no time for personal reflection or development. They were trapped in a never-ending cycle that left no space for their individuality to shine. In this environment, the concept of camaraderie and brotherhood seemed almost laughable. The soldiers were not allowed to form close bonds with one another. The army needed them to remain loyal only to their duties, not to each other. In many ways, they were trained to be nothing more than tools, useful for a specific purpose, but disposable once that purpose was fulfilled. The feeling of being expendable was something that weighed heavily on their hearts. While they were part of a larger cause, that cause was always distant, abstract, and impersonal. The soldiers were not fighting for a noble ideal. They were fighting because they had to. The need to survive was what drove them, not the hope of achieving glory or honor. Each battle, each skirmish, was just another task to be completed, and even victory held little meaning in a life so filled with emptiness. And yet, despite all of this, there was a strange comfort in the routine. It was familiar, it was predictable. The soldiers didn't have to think much about what came next. They simply followed orders, executed the tasks set before them, and went to sleep at the end of the day. There was something almost soothing in that. The world outside the army was chaotic, filled with uncertainty. The life of a soldier, while dull and demanding, was at least straightforward. There were no decisions to make, no difficult choices to face. All that was required was obedience, and in a way, that provided a sense of security. The realization that their lives were not their own, that they had no control over their destiny, was a bitter pill to swallow. But the soldiers learned to accept it. They learned to surrender to the routine, to forget the hopes and dreams they once had. In the end, it wasn't the hardships of training, the exhaustion of their bodies, or the loneliness of their existence that hurt the most. It was the feeling that they were nothing more than cogs in a machine, going through the motions until they no longer had the strength to keep going. Their bodies became stronger, more resilient to the grueling demands of soldiering, but their minds were slowly worn down by the endless repetition. The soldiers would continue this cycle day after day, year after year, until they were too old to carry on, until their bodies could no longer endure the toll of constant training and fighting. And even then, there was no real rest for them. Old soldiers were often sent to garrison duty, stationed at far-flung outposts, performing the same menial tasks, guarding castles and villages, their lives still tied to the needs of the army. As time went on, the soldiers began to lose track of their pasts. The life they had once known before the army faded away, replaced by the routines and rituals of soldiering. They no longer thought about home, about the family they had left behind. Their memories became foggy, and the world they had once known seemed like a distant dream. The army was their world now, and it was the only life they knew. Some soldiers were lucky. They would find themselves at the center of a battle, their moment to shine, to prove themselves. But for most, there was no such moment. For most soldiers, the war was just an abstract concept, something they had been trained to fight for without ever truly understanding why. The army was their home, their purpose, and their prison. And so, the cycle continued. The soldiers trained, they fought, they endured. Their lives were shaped by the constant grind of military life. It was not the life they had chosen, but it was the life they were bound to. And in the end, that was all they had. The day that a soldier first sets foot on the battlefield is often a day filled with fear and anticipation. It is the moment that their endless training, the hours spent drilling in mud-soaked fields, is supposed to culminate in the proving of their strength and skill. But for many soldiers, that moment does not bring glory or excitement. Instead, it brings a deep sense of unease, a realization that the training was nothing more than preparation for something far more dangerous and disorienting than they could have ever imagined. The soldier, fresh from months or even years of monotonous drills, finds themselves in a completely new world. The battlefield is nothing like the dusty training grounds. The noise is overwhelming, the deafening clash of metal, the shouts of officers, and the screams of men, some in victory, others in agony. The air is thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and the acrid scent of smoke. There is no order, no rhythm to the chaos around them. The battlefield is a place where instinct, not training, takes over. The soldier who had practiced sword strikes and shield formations with precise, calculated movements now finds that their body acts on reflex. There is no time to think, there is only action. At first, it is difficult to even process what is happening. The soldier's mind races, but they feel as though they are trapped in a fog. The training, which had once felt like such a rigid, unnecessary part of life, seems distant and useless in the face of the raw, primal violence of battle. Their body moves of its own accord, and the mind struggles to keep up, caught between the horror of what is happening and the need to act. Each swing of the sword, each step forward, is automatic, driven by nothing more than a soldier's instinct to survive. For many soldiers, this initial experience of battle is more about confusion and fear than any sense of glory. The soldiers are not warriors, they are just men caught in the chaos of war, trying to make sense of a situation that is beyond their control. The formations they had practiced so diligently are shattered almost instantly. The enemy is not a faceless opponent. They are real, living men, many of whom are just like the soldiers themselves, tired, frightened, and desperate to survive. There is no honor in the chaos. There is only survival. The psychological toll of the first battle is profound. In training, the soldiers had been taught to follow orders, to think in terms of strategy and discipline. But in the heat of battle, none of that seems to matter. There are no strategies in the noise and confusion, no time to consider tactics. It is simply a matter of fighting to stay alive. The soldier's mind may reel from the carnage around them, the blood, the cries of the wounded, the sight of men falling. For the first time, the soldier realizes that the life they have chosen, or been thrust into, is one of constant danger, where survival is never guaranteed. Many soldiers, in the moments between fights, will retreat into themselves. They try to block out the terror around them, focusing on the task at hand. But the fear never truly leaves them. It is always there, lurking in the back of their minds, a constant companion as they move from one battle to the next. The soldier begins to understand that this is not a one-time experience. Battle will become a regular part of their life, each engagement taking a piece of their humanity away. In the days following their first battle, the soldiers returned to camp. The camaraderie they had been told would form between them is often absent. There are no moments of celebration. There are no cheers of victory. Instead, there is a quiet understanding between the soldiers that what they have just experienced cannot be easily put into words. The wounds, both physical and mental, are still fresh. There is no time to dwell on the horrors they have witnessed, for the army does not allow for weakness. The soldiers are expected to move on, to prepare for the next battle. The routine they had grown so accustomed to returns quickly, but now it feels different. The rituals of cleaning weapons, mending armor, and training again feel almost pointless. The soldiers have seen the true face of war, and nothing they do in camp can change. What they have experienced as the days go by, the soldiers begin to adjust. They become more accustomed to the violence, more capable of moving through the battlefield with less fear. But this does not mean they grow stronger. In fact, the constant cycle of combat begins to wear them down, body and soul. The soldier, who once saw themselves as a disciplined and dutiful servant of their Lord, begins to see themselves as something else, just another piece of the machine, a cog in the machinery of war. They have learned that war does not care for individual lives. The battlefield is indifferent to their existence. They are disposable, just like the hundreds of other soldiers who have come before them. The brutality of war is relentless. Even in moments of peace, when the army is not actively engaged in battle, the soldiers live with the constant fear that they will soon be thrust back into the chaos. It becomes a part of their existence, this perpetual waiting for the next battle, the next fight, the next moment of terror, The soldiers have no control over their own fates. They follow the orders given to them, and they endure the hardships that come with this life. But deep down, they know that their lives are fragile. One wrong move, one misstep, and they could find themselves as one of the fallen, just another nameless body in the dirt. The psychological toll of repeated battles is devastating. Soldiers who have fought in several campaigns begin to lose their sense of self. The horrors they have witnessed become too much to bear. The faces of the fallen blur together. The screams of the dying become indistinguishable. The soldier who was once full of hope and determination becomes a shell of their former self. They become numb, detached from the world around them, just going through the motions of survival. There is no longer any thought of honor or glory. There is only the desire to make it through the day, to live one more day, one more hour, one more minute. For some soldiers, this numbing detachment is a survival mechanism. It is the only way to endure the horrors they face. If they allowed themselves to feel the weight of the deaths they have witnessed, the destruction they have caused, they might lose their sanity. So they shut it out, focusing only on the next task, the next battle. But deep down, they know that this detachment comes at a cost. The soldier who has seen too much, who has lost too much, will never be the same again. Their innocence is gone, replaced by the harsh realities of war. And yet, even in this numbness, there is still a sense of duty. The soldiers may have lost their sense of self, but they have not lost their loyalty to their comrades. They fight not for the glory of their lord or the promise of riches, but for the bond they share with their fellow soldiers. In the heat of battle, when the world seems to be falling apart around them, it is the soldier beside them that keeps them going. It is the shared experience of survival that unites them, even as everything else falls away. But this bond, too, is fragile. War has a way of breaking even the strongest connections. Soldiers are sent to fight in far-flung lands, separated from their comrades, from the life they once knew. The life of a soldier is one of constant motion, always on the move, always following orders. It is a life of impermanence, of uncertainty, and in the end, even the bonds of brotherhood may not be enough to keep the soldier from succumbing to the weight of their experience. As time passes, many soldiers begin to question why they continue to fight. What is the purpose of this endless cycle of violence? What are they really fighting for? The answer, for most, is simple: survival. But that is not enough. The need to survive is primal, but it does not fill the emptiness inside. It does not make up for the lives lost, the families torn apart, the pieces of themselves that have been left behind on the battlefield. The soldier's life is not just defined by the wars they fight, it is shaped by the toll those wars take on their body, their mind, and their soul. There is no escaping the past. For every soldier, the battlefield becomes a part of them. The sights, the sounds, the smells, they linger long after the battle is over. The soldier who has fought in many wars carries these memories with them, always. The weight of their experience never leaves. It is a burden they will carry for the rest of their lives, one that shapes who they are and how they see the world. The days after battle are often filled with a sense of unease. The bloodshed has ended, and the soldiers return to camp, but the echoes of the violence linger. The adrenaline that surged through their bodies during the battle has dissipated, leaving only the cold, heavy weight of what has just transpired. The soldier's body is sore, bruised, and tired, but it is the mind that bears the true scars of the fight. In the aftermath, there is no time for rest. The army's needs must be tended to. Wounded soldiers are carried back to camp, where the healers work tirelessly to mend broken bodies. But the psychological wounds are far more difficult to treat. The horrors witnessed during battle, the mutilated bodies, the screams of the dying, the faces of comrades lost do not simply fade with time. For many soldiers, these memories are etched into their minds, replaying in their dreams, haunting them during the quiet moments when they are left alone with their thoughts. The soldier finds that the distance between their past life and their present is growing wider with each passing day. They are no longer the person they once were before the war. The soldier who had hoped for a life filled with purpose, with meaning, now wonders if they have become nothing more than a cog in an endless machine, destined to fight battles they do not understand for causes they cannot fully grasp. The question of loyalty begins to weigh heavily on the soldier's mind. They are loyal to their lord, to the army, but they are also loyal to the men they fight alongside. It is in the bonds forged in the heat of battle that the soldier begins to find a sense of purpose. The camaraderie that grows between soldiers is unlike any other. It is born not of shared dreams or ideals, but of shared survival. The soldier fights not just for their lord, but for their comrades. Each battle fought is another step in the collective struggle for survival. In a way, the soldiers are all bound together by their shared suffering. Yet, as the soldier spends more time in the camp, a deep sense of doubt begins to take root. They look at the soldiers around them, many of whom have become their closest companions, and wonder if they truly understand why they fight. Do they fight for honor, for glory, for wealth, or is it simply because there is no other choice? The soldier knows that in the end, their fight is not for a noble cause. It is for survival, for the preservation of their own life and the lives of those around them. The purpose of the war seems less clear with each passing day. There is a quiet rebellion that begins to stir within the soldier's heart. The more they witness the carnage, the more they begin to question the very nature of the war they are fighting. The soldiers are constantly told that they are part of something larger than themselves, that they are fighting for a noble cause. But the soldier knows that in the end, it is just one side against another. There is no inherent goodness in one cause over the other. Both sides are filled with men, just like the soldier, struggling to survive, to protect their families, their homes, their lands. The distinction between good and evil begins to blur. The internal conflict becomes overwhelming. The soldier wants to believe that they are part of something greater, that their efforts are making a difference in the world. But they cannot help but wonder if they are simply pawns in a game that they do not understand. The soldier becomes increasingly disillusioned with the idea of loyalty. Loyalty to the Lord, to the army, to the cause, it all feels like a trap. The more the soldier thinks about it, the more they realize that the only thing they truly have loyalty to is the bond they share with their fellow soldiers. They fight for each other, because without that bond, they would be nothing. The days in camp after the battle are often filled with a quiet, almost oppressive stillness. The soldiers rest, clean their weapons, and tend to their wounds, but there is little sense of celebration. The victory, if it can even be called that, feels hollow. The soldiers have won, but at what cost? They have lost friends, comrades, brothers-in-law, and the pain of that loss never truly leaves. It lingers in their thoughts, in their conversations, in the way they move. The camp feels like a place of waiting, a place where time slows down, where the soldiers can do nothing but wait for the next battle, the next conflict. In these days of stillness, when the soldiers are left to reflect, they begin to question their very identity. The person they were before the war feels like a distant memory. Their identity, once defined by family, community, and a sense of future, has been replaced by the identity of a soldier. But is this all they are now? A soldier with no past, no future, only the present, shaped by the demands of war. The soldier begins to wonder if they will ever be able to return to the life they once knew. They wonder if the person they were before the war still exists, buried somewhere beneath the layers of trauma and pain. The soldier knows that there is no going back. The war has changed them forever, and though they may survive, they will never be the same. The person they once were is gone, replaced by someone who knows the darkness of war, who understands the true cost of survival. Loyalty, once a simple concept, has become a complex web of emotions. The soldier is loyal to their comrades, to those who fight beside them, because they understand the shared experience of battle. But loyalty to the Lord, to the cause, to the abstract ideals of war thieves are no longer so clear. The soldier realizes that they are not just fighting for a noble cause. They are fighting because they have no other choice, because they have become trapped in a cycle of violence that they cannot escape. The war, it seems, is not something that can be won. It is simply something that must be endured. The question arises, what is the cost of this loyalty? The soldier begins to recognize that loyalty, though important, can also be a prison. It binds them to an unending cycle of violence, where each battle is followed by another, where victory is short-lived and the losses are permanent. The soldier's identity becomes entwined with the very violence they are forced to endure. They wonder if there will ever be a time when the cycle will stop, or if they will die still carrying the weight of their allegiance. There is also the realization that loyalty to a cause or lord is not always reciprocal. The soldier fights for their lord, but the lord is far removed from the soldier's reality. The lord gives orders from the safety of a castle, surrounded by wealth and comfort, while the soldier bleeds and suffers in the dirt. The soldier begins to see this disparity and starts to question the fairness of their loyalty. Their lord may promise protection, honor, and riches, but for the soldier, there is only death and destruction. And when the battle ends, when the fighting stops, it is not the Lord who mourns the fallen. It is the soldiers who have lost their comrades, their brothers in arms, and their own sense of self. As the days drag on, the soldier becomes increasingly disillusioned with the military life. The rituals, the endless training, the fight after fight, it all begins to feel like a futile effort. Nothing changes, nothing improves. There is no ultimate goal, no victory that will bring peace. Instead, there is only the promise of more war, more death, more loss. The soldier becomes numb to the violence, their mind shutting down in an attempt to protect itself from the horrors they have witnessed. But even in this numbness, there is a flicker of something deep inside, a flicker of hope, a desire for something more. The soldier dreams of a life outside of the army, a life where they are not defined by their rank, their armor, or their weapon. They dream of peace, of family, of a home they can return to. But those dreams are distant, impossible. The war has consumed them, and they are no longer sure if they can ever escape its grip. In the end, the soldier understands that the war has taken everything from them. Their innocence, their hopes, their identity, all have been lost in the bloody, grinding machine of war. And yet, they endure. They fight because they have no other choice. They march because there is no place to go. They serve because it is the only life they know. The passage of time begins to feel like a distant concept for the soldiers, a blur of days that merge into weeks, and then into months. For many, the experience of being in the army has become one of endless repetition, a ceaseless cycle that never seems to break. The training, the battles, the aftermath, these events no longer hold the sharpness they once did. What began as a life of anticipation and uncertainty has transformed into a grim routine. The soldier wakes each day, unsure of whether today will bring another battle or just more monotonous duties. But the uncertainty is no longer filled with fear or hope. It is simply a fact of life. The first few battles were filled with terror and adrenaline. The soldiers moved with urgency, driven by fear, by a deep instinct to survive. The uncertainty of battle kept them alert, kept them focused on the present. But as time passed, the soldiers began to recognize the pattern. They knew what to expect. The sword strikes, the shield clashes, the screams, all of it became predictable, even if it was always harrowing. Over time, the soldier learned to compartmentalize these experiences, to lock away the trauma in a corner of their mind, in an attempt to preserve their sanity. Yet, no matter how much they tried to push it away, the war began to take a toll on them in ways they hadn't expected. The mind, so trained to endure the violence of battle, began to break under the weight of constant conflict. The repetitive nature of war was wearing away at the soldiers' sense of self. They no longer remembered the person they were before they joined the army. It was as if their past self had faded into a dream, something distant and unreachable. The person they had been before the war no longer seemed to exist. The soldier had become a part of the war cog in the machine. They began to feel a sense of exhaustion that ran deeper than the physical strain of combat. Their bodies ached from the constant marching, the never-ending drills, and the weight of armor that they wore day in and day out. But it was the mental fatigue that weighed on them the most. The constant exposure to violence, the endless repetition of the same brutal tasks, and the indifference of their superiors to their well-being created a deep sense of hopelessness. The soldier began to question whether there was any purpose to it all. What were they really fighting for? What had they truly gained from all this struggle? As each battle passed, the soldier found it harder to recall what had once motivated them to fight. The promises of honor, glory, and land had long since faded into empty words. There was no glory in the endless bloodshed, no honor in the brutal mechanics of war. The soldier was caught in a never-ending cycle of violence, where each victory was fleeting and each loss was permanent. Even the most noble ideals seemed distant and hollow. In the face of the daily grind of military life, what made it worse was the constant presence of death. It followed the soldier everywhere, an ever-present companion that no one could escape. The soldier saw death in every battle, in every skirmish, and in every glance toward the fallen. They were surrounded by it, immersed in it, yet they could not grow accustomed to it. Death had no predictability. It was random, it was final, and it was often senseless. The soldier could never escape the awareness that death could be just as fleeting as life itself. One moment they could be standing, fighting alongside their comrades, and the next, they could be lying dead on the field. The soldier began to grow numb to death. At first, each death had been a shock, a blow to the soldier's humanity. Each fallen comrade had been mourned, each casualty felt deeply. But as time passed, the soldier began to feel less. The pain of loss began to fade, replaced by a cold detachment. They no longer cried for the dead, they simply moved on. The bonds they had formed with their comrades, those who had fought beside them in the trenches of battle, began to dissolve. The soldier could no longer afford to feel the loss of each comrade. To mourn each death would be to succumb to despair. And so, the soldier hardened their heart, shutting out the pain and focusing only on survival. Yet, despite this hardened exterior, a quiet despair began to creep in. The soldier realized that this was no life. This was an existence defined by death of comrades, death of hope, and eventually, the death of the self. There was no escape from this cycle. It was a brutal truth that each soldier had to face. Their existence had become a series of violent events, and they were powerless to break free. In the quiet moments between battles, when the soldiers were allowed to rest, there was little comfort to be found. The barracks, though filled with comrades, felt empty. The soldiers, while in each other's company, were still isolated by the invisible wall of trauma and fear that surrounded them. They had become shells of their former selves, marked by experiences they could not share, memories they could not escape. They talked little of the war, for there were no words to describe it. Instead, they would sit in silence, staring into the fire or at the walls, waiting for the next battle to begin. Even sleep, once a respite, became a source of discomfort. The soldier would lie in their cot, their mind racing with thoughts of the next day, the next battle, and the next loss. They would drift into an uneasy slumber, only to be awoken by the sounds of distant trumpets or the frantic cries of comrades preparing for the day's march. There was no rest for the soldier's soul. The war had invaded every part of their life, and there was no corner in which they could find peace. It was in these moments of stillness, when the soldier was forced to confront their own thoughts, that the internal conflict grew most intense. The soldier began to question everything: their loyalty, their purpose, and their identity. They had been soldiers for so long that they had forgotten what it was like to be anything else. They had forgotten what it was like to dream of a life outside of war, to imagine a future that didn't involve the constant cycle of violence. The soldier wondered if they had lost the ability to dream altogether. They had become numb to the idea of a future. All they could think about was survival, getting through each day, each battle, and each loss. The concept of a life beyond the army seemed like a distant dream, something that belonged to someone else, someone who had never known the horrors of war. And yet, deep within, there remained a flicker of longing, a longing for peace, for normalcy, for a life where death and violence were not constant companions. The soldier longed for the simple things they had once taken for granted: family, warmth, love, and community. These things felt far beyond their reach, yet the longing for them was undeniable. It was in these fleeting moments of longing that the soldier would feel the weight of the war most acutely. The conflict within the soldier grew sharper as time passed. They had given so much of their body, mind, and soul to the army, to the war. But what had they received in return? The answer was nothing but pain, loss, and exhaustion. The soldier began to realize that they had been living for a war that had no end, no resolution. They had spent so much time preparing for battle, so much time focused on surviving the next fight, that they had forgotten what it meant to live. Now, as they looked at the world around them, the soldier saw only the endless grind of violence and suffering. The wars they fought in seemed to have no end, no victory. Each battle simply led to another, and each soldier was just one more piece in a war that stretched on forever. The soldier began to feel as though they were living in a state of suspended animation, where the past was a distant memory, the future was uncertain, and the present was defined only by the constant noise of war. And yet, even in this weariness, there was still a glimmer of something more. A soldier, after all, is not just a machine of war. Beneath the hardened exterior, beneath the trauma and the exhaustion, there still existed the possibility for a future of peace, of rest, and of a life beyond the battlefield. But that future seemed impossibly far away. The soldier, for all their exhaustion, could not bring themselves to give up the fight, because they knew that if they did, it would be the final surrender to despair. And so, the cycle continued. The soldier fought on, day after day, battle after battle, carrying the weight of the war within them, never knowing when or if it would ever end. The weight of the soldier's existence has become a burden that presses down on them at all times. The relentless cycle of violence, the endless fighting, and the constant loss have stripped away everything that once made life worth living. The soldier's body, worn and weary, moves mechanically through the motions of war, and the world around them has become a blur of bloodshed and sorrow. Their identity has been swallowed up by the army, their humanity reduced to a name on a roster, a number in the line. They once dreamed of heroism, of a life defined by valor and honor, but now those dreams feel as distant as a forgotten song. Every victory on the battlefield is hollow, and every loss is more devastating than the last. In the early days, the soldier had fought with conviction, with belief that they were part of something larger, something greater. But now, that conviction has withered away. They fight not for a cause, not for glory, but simply because there is nothing else to do. The war is all they have known for so long that it has become part of their very being. The soldier finds themselves at a crossroads, torn between the desire for peace and the reality that peace may never come. There is a longing for escape, for a life away from the battlefield, away from the death and destruction. They dream of a world where they are not defined by their armor, where they are not weighed down by the burden of constant violence. They long for a place where the sounds of swords clashing and men screaming do not echo in their mind. But the soldier knows that such a place is out of reach, for they have been consumed by war. Their past, their future, and their identity are all bound to the battlefield. It is in these quiet moments of reflection that the soldier begins to confront the profound loss they have suffered, not just the loss of their comrades, but the loss of themselves. The soldier has changed, and they know it. They have become hardened, detached from the world they once knew. They have lost their innocence, their sense of hope, and their belief in a better future. They are not the person they were when they first picked up a sword, nor will they ever be again. The battle for survival has taken everything from them. Their very soul feels fractured, torn apart by the constant violence and the endless struggle. The loss of their comrades weighs heavily on the soldier's heart. Each death, each comrade who falls beside them, feels like a personal blow. They have lost so many that it has become hard to keep track of the names, the faces, the voices. Every time they march into battle, they know that there is a chance. They will never return, that they will become one of the fallen. And yet, despite the constant threat of death, the soldier keeps fighting. The instinct for survival, for life, is too strong. But even that survival feels increasingly meaningless. The soldier begins to understand that the greatest loss they have suffered is not the lives of their comrades, but the loss of their own humanity. They have been so consumed by the war that they no longer know who they are beyond the battlefield. There is no self left to go back to. The war has eaten away at them, piece by piece, until all that remains is the soldier. They are nothing more than a tool of war, a machine whose sole purpose is to fight, to kill, and to survive. And yet, despite all of this, There is a flicker of something deep inside, a desire for redemption. The soldier longs for a way out, a way to reclaim their humanity, to find meaning in a world that has been consumed by violence. They may never be able to escape the war, but they can still search for a reason to keep fighting. It is this search for redemption that keeps the soldier moving forward. They fight not because they believe in the cause anymore, but because they need to find some semblance of peace, of purpose. The soldiers around them have become shadows of their former selves, each one locked in their own battle with despair. But there is a bond that still exists between them, the bond of shared suffering. The soldier knows that they are not alone in their struggles. Every soldier carries the weight of the war, the weight of the losses, the weight of their own brokenness. And in that shared experience, there is a form of solidarity. It is a silent bond, forged through the horrors of battle, but it is a bond nonetheless. It is this bond that keeps the soldier fighting, even when every part of them longs for escape. The soldier fights not for the Lord, not for glory, not even for survival. They fight for the comrades beside them, for the men who have become their family in the trenches of war. The soldier knows that without them, they would have nothing left. It is the loyalty to those around them that keeps them tethered to the world, even as the world around them falls apart. Yet, even this loyalty is tested. The soldier begins to wonder if their loyalty has been misplaced. They have fought for so long, endured so much, and what has it brought them? More death, more violence, and more despair. The soldier begins to ask themselves whether they are simply being used, whether their loyalty to their comrades and to the cause is being exploited. The realization that they have been nothing more than pawns in someone else's game hits them like a stone. But they cannot stop fighting. They cannot stop because there is nothing else to do. The weight of this realization settles heavily in the soldier's mind. They have fought for years, for causes they did not fully understand, for leaders who care little for their lives. They have given everything, and they have nothing left to show for it. The war has taken everything: their past, their future, their friends, and their sense of self. And yet, they endure. They continue to fight because there is no other option. The soldier knows that their struggle is not one that will end with a single victory. It will not end when the war is over. The war will never truly be over, not for them. The soldier's mind has been shattered by the horrors they have seen. They will carry the scars of battle with them for the rest of their lives, even if they survive. The psychological wounds of war are deeper than any physical injury, and they cannot be healed. They will live with them, just as they will live with the memories of the fallen. The faces of their comrades, those who fought beside them and died beside them, will haunt them forever. But despite this, there is still a spark of hope within the soldier. They do not know what the future holds, but they know that they cannot give up. They cannot surrender to despair, not while there is still a chance to fight. The soldier may not understand the cause they fight for, but they understand the men beside them. They understand the loyalty they share, the bond that has been forged in blood. It is this bond that keeps them going, even as the war continues to strip away everything else. And so, the soldier fights on. They fight not for victory, not for glory, but for the simple hope that one day the cycle of violence will end. One day they may find peace, but that day is not today. Today, the soldier continues to fight, to survive, to endure, because that is all they have left.